Hi there, and welcome to part 2 of our tutorial for creating game screens and menus, etc. in Monogame and XNA. So in the first tutorial, we created all our sort of manager classes or interfaces, and we got a very basic intro screen. So if we just run what we had, we just get a blue screen, and if we hit exit, we can exit the game. So today we're going to build on this a little bit, and I'm going to show you how we can add some text to our game to make it a bit more interesting. So in Monogame or XNA, depending on what we're using, adding text is pretty straightforward. Sort of consists of three separate parts, and those parts are we have a string, which is our actual text, so just a normal string. We have the position, which is a vector 2. And we have the SpriteFont. And a SpriteFont is essentially just sort of all the metadata related to what font we want to render on the screen. So it will contain the name of the font, such as Arial, the size of the font, and some other things, probably if it's bold, italic, etc. So those are the sort of three main components. I'll just make sure this is loaded in. So we just choose Content Manager, dot load, and then in these sort of angular brackets, we tell the type is a SpriteFont, and then we'll give it a name and the sort of quotes in a second. I suppose the final part is the colour, so we can pick any colour, so we'll go with yellow since it's quite standout. Okay, so those are the four components. I did forget about colour there briefly, but that make up any sort of text object in our game. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a class that we can then reuse at will to sort of draw text onto our screen. So I'm going to right click on the solution, go to add, go to new item and click class, and I'm going to call this what will I call it? Just going to call it text.cs. Okay, so this opens up a new class. We're going to say it's internal. We've only got one project in the solution, therefore we can make this class internal. And we're going to add some properties to it. Just some internal properties. So basically what we've just said. So we're going to have a string, and I'll call this text string. In fact, no, I'll call it message, so it's a bit nicer. So we want the message that will be displayed on the screen, and we want to be able to get and set that. So it's just a normal field. We're going to have our SpriteFont, and I'll just call that a SpriteFont, so we can make it quite clear. We're getting a set. We're going to have the position, which is vector 2. Vector 2, for anyone that's not familiar with it, is just essentially an x and y position. And we're going to have a colour, and I'm going to use the British spelling of colour. So that's essentially the class. So we can then create a new object of this fairly easily. So we can just say var text obj equals new text, and then we can say text obj dot SpriteFont equals SpriteFont, text obj dot color equals color, text obj dot position equals position, text obj dot text message equals text. So all we're doing here is creating a new object of type text, and then just populating its properties with the information we've got up here. So that's all fair and well. So the next step to get this actually rendering on the screen It's pretty straightforward. So what we're going to do is we're going to move the declaration of the text object up to here, and we'll call it mtext. And then instead of saying text obj, we'll just change it to mtext. So that means we can now use it throughout our whole class. And then we go down to the draw method and we take our sprite batch and we look at it, and we've got this drawString method. And if we look here at our sort of overloads, you can see it fits in fairly well. So we've got a SpriteFont, we've got a string, we've got a vector to position, we've got a colour. So this is the overload we want to use, and we can just say mtext dot SpriteFont, mtext dot message, which is our string, mtext dot position, which is a position, and mtext dot color. Okay, now that's all there really is to getting the text to draw. So we need to go into our content folder and double click on this content.mcgb. Now this is slightly different if you're using XNA. This is obviously Monogame, but I'm sure you'll be able to work it out. You can look at another tutorial if you're struggling, or you can ask and I'll try and help you in the comments. So if we now right click on the content in the pipeline, go to add, and we click on new item, we can see this SpriteFont description. That's what we want. We're going to give it the name title, and then close it down, hit yes, and inside our load we want to load the title one now. So if we run this code, we should see an error. Okay, so that's a nice exception we're getting thrown because I've not really tested this code yet. So essentially what's happening here is we're trying to call spritebatch.drawString. However, we've not called spritebatch.begin and probably not called spritebatch.end. So we don't want to see this problem every time. So in our game screen manager class, what we can do is before we call screen.draw, we can just say mSpritebatch.begin. And then after the call we can say spritebatch.end. So what that does is it sets up the sprite batch, gets it all ready for adding draw calls, and then once we call draw of the current screen, we don't have to internally then keep calling begin and end. So as you can see now on our screen when we hit play, it says I am the text at position, I think it was 100, 100. So that's great. So now we've got a sort of reusable object. We can improve the code still, make it even easier. So instead of having a single text object, what we're going to do is we're going to have a list of text objects, and we're going to call that text list, and we're going to create a new list, and we can make this read only. So what that means is once it's been constructed once, which is what this is, so we've declared a new object of type list text. We don't want to be able to create any more of it. So a list is essentially just a collection of objects. So whenever we create an object of type text, we can add it to this list, and it makes sort of managing all the objects really easy. So if there's certain functions that we're going to be performing over and over again, for instance drawing it, then we can loop over using a for each or a for loop over a list and draw them in sort of a single call essentially. Not so much a single call as in we're sort of paralysing it, but just it makes the code much more readable. So now we want to go back to our text object again and create a new object. And now what we can say is mTextList.add and text object. So the .add method on a list just adds an item. So now we've got our test object, but we can see here that this line of code is going to be broken. So what we want to do is we want to have a for each loop, and we want to iterate over our text list. And we're just going to call each object in the list text. So if we look at this code here, so we've got the for each, which is quite simple, then var text. So this just creates a temporary object essentially that it grabs from mtext list. So it iterates over, so it starts at the beginning of mtext list, So the first time round this loop, the first item in mtext list, that's what text will point to. The second time mtext list goes round, this will be object 2, so on and so forth. So obviously we've only got one object in our list, so it's going to act sort of fairly straightforward anyway. And instead of mtext, we can then just change this to text, and our code should work just the same. So if we run it, we can see I am the text. So why is this helpful? Well, if we want to create a second object, so we can reuse the text object again, it's the same type, but we want to change the text this time to blah, just because I can't think of anything, and we'll change the position to 200 by 200. So now we should see 2 lines. So there we go. So we've got I am the text at 100, 100. That gets added to the list down here. We create a new object with the text is blah in position 200, 200, and it gets added here. But notice that we didn't have to change any other code. It was simple as just adding a new object. So it's really powerful. So generally my rule of thumb is if I'm doing something more than once with the exact same code, I'll probably create a class first of all, so that I can reuse the code in the class, and then secondly I'll probably create a list of that class to make it really easy to manage the objects. So this can get even more powerful. We can actually improve this even further by creating some code that actually draws our text. So if we go inside the text class, we can create a method called draw that takes a sprite batch object. So we pass in our sprite batch, and then we can call sprite batch.string internally. We can get rid of the text part, and we can just use the members. So this will now draw its own version of the information. So it uses SpriteFont from inside itself, message from inside itself, position, etc. And an intro screen, we can change this now to say text.draw and pass in sprite batch. Again, so we've now sort of self-contained it. We don't have to sort of reach out and give access to all this information if we don't want to. However, this is a fairly small class. It's not really harming us to have getting sets for each method. But sometimes you want to encapsulate the data, and to encapsulate the data means that you only want the class itself to be able to change certain aspects of it, which is quite important. So for instance, in our game screen manager, we have encapsulated the game screens, so we don't want any other classes to be able to touch the game screens apart from going through the proper methods such as changing screen, pushing screen, etc. So our text class is getting there now, so if we run our code, again, no more changes. But the next thing we can do is clear up the sort of the code a bit more. So this code here is pretty verbose. C# gives us something called an initializer of the object, and what you can do is you can just say SpriteFont equals SpriteFont, then a comma, and then color equals color, comma, position equals position, comma, message equals text. And then with the braces between this, we don't need the brackets, and then a semicolon, and that sort of acts the same way. However, it constructs it all in one call, so it's a bit more efficient and it's much more readable. And we can do the same here again, so we can just copy this. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to get rid of this stuff here. But I'll bring it back just for the SpriteFont. Because I'm lazy and can't bother typing that out again. Okay, so color.yellow. Position. Okay, so now with the sort of same object, so what we're going to do is we're going to change this to 200, 200 again, and just say blah. So we'll now use the initializer object instead of just using the properties directly. And again, if we run this, you can see the text on the screen. So the last thing I'm going to show you is the ability to sort of center text. So sometimes it's quite nice if we have the height and width of a screen. We want to make sure that the text is centered either horizontally, or we can have it vertically, or we could have it both so that it's bang on the middle of the screen. So I'm going to show you how we can do it horizontally today, and as a wee exercise you can try and convert the code so that it then sort of sets it vertically. So the first thing we want to do is declare height and width. Now this isn't the best place to do it, but it's the easiest way for the time being. I'll show you in another tutorial how we can actually inject this through properly. So I know that my screen is 800 by 600, so yeah, I'm going to set just two constant variables, window width, window height, and set them up as 800 by 600. The next thing I want to do is create another class. I'm going to call this one utility. Now what utility is going to do is it's going to be a place in our code base where we can add any code that we might use once, we might use twice, but they're just sort of helper functions, etc. They're not really doing anything else. And I'm going to create a method that returns a vector 2, so it returns a position in 2D space, and it's going to be called center text horizontal. And the thing we want to pass in is the window width, which we can just make an integer. I also want to pass in a float position for the Y, so where we want it to sit in the Y axis. I want to pass in the SpriteFont that we're going to be using to draw this text, and finally we're going to pass in the text itself that we're actually going to be rendering. And X and A gives us some handy sort of helpers that helps us. So the first thing we need to do is work out the size of the text. So we're going to create a variable called text size, and to do that we want to do SpriteFont measure string, and measure string returns the length or the size of a string when it will be rendered using this font. So that's quite helpful. So that gives us the size of the string using the font that we pass in. And then what we can do is we can return a new vector 2, where the Y component is dead easy, so we can fill that in first, and that's just YPOS. And the X position we want to calculate using the window width and our text size. So the first thing we want to do is, because we want to center it horizontally, i.e. in the middle of sort of the X axis, we want to take the window width and we want to divide that by 2. So that will give us the sort of the middle position. And then from that we want to subtract the size of our text along the x-axis as well, divided by 2. So the reason for that is if you've got a massive big string, then obviously the position that we centre it in is going to be smaller than if you have a wee small font, because obviously the actual size of the text matters. So it's fairly simple, it's a nice helper, and you can probably reuse it in classes, and you can probably tell fairly straightforward how we can change that if we want to centre it vertically. Just probably change widths to heights and x's to y's, etc. So if we go back to our class text now, I'm going to create another method inside here that will utilise this this method, and I'm going to call it public void center horizontal, and I want to pass in the window width and the Y position that we want to render it to. And all I want to say is position is equal to, so utility, so a class. But notice when we press dot we don't get any methods, so we could create a new utility class. However, we can do something a bit easier, and we can say that this method is static. And what static means is you don't have to have an instance or an object of a class to use its sort of variables or to use its functions. So here we've got this function center text horizontal is static, which means that we can do just something like utility dot center text horizontal, and as you can see we can use that method. Now static is a bit of a sort of poison chalice, so to speak. You've got to be really careful when you use it, but for utility classes where it's just a one-off function that you want to use just to return a single value, then they're really helpful. So if we pass in our window width now, which we've passed through, our Y position, which we've passed through, the sprite font of the class, and the message of the class, and that will set our position. So now when we are setting our position in intro screen, we can do a bit of magic. So instead of saying position here, we want to say textObj.center. So we want to call this function. We want to pass in window width, and then I want to say window height divided by 2 for our Y position. So this should render it right in the sort of centre of the screen, really, more or less. Obviously it's not quite centred on the Y axis, but it's close enough. So you can now see blah is centred, and we can do the same for the one above. So we can say textObj.center horizontal, again window width, and we could then just say we want that at position 100 for the F. And you can see it's now centred horizontally. The last thing I can show you is if we open up our code, which is here. If you right click and open it with Notepad or something similar, you can see all the metadata in our SpriteFont. So I'm going to change its title into 32 just to make it a bit larger, and I'm going to also add in another text font. So if we go back into content, right click, add new item, go to SpriteFont and call this normal. Make sure it's saved. Run it now. We should have 2 different SpriteFonts. As you can see, we've got one that's a lot sort of bigger than the other one that we can use for a title. So the last thing I'm going to do is just change this so that it's actually giving us some information. So I'm going to call this intro screen for the message, and I'm going to say press any key to continue. So we're on that finally. You can see it's beginning to look a bit more like a message. So that's the end of our sort of tutorial for today. In the next part I'm going to show you how we can have a sort of background image or maybe some images on the screen, and I'm going to also probably add another screen in, and we can start showing you how to transition between the two. So thanks for watching. If you've got any questions, don't hesitate to ask. Cheers.